in Chicago and Massachusetts, and now here at Cal State Fullerton, where I'm an associate professor in the Department of Secondary Ed. I actually know several of you that are here, so it's great to see you, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives about some of what we're talking about today. My research is really around teacher agency, and so what that means is I'm really interested in how teachers use their professional expertise, their political agency, their personal agency to enact educational equity and justice, especially in heavily regulated classrooms. And what I mean by heavily regulated classrooms, I mean, for most of us when we're teaching, we have a whole barrage of things we're required to do, whether it's specific content we're expected to teach, the state standards that we're accountable to, or other types of classroom examples where we need to sort of really think about sort of what are the boundaries around us and what are the ways in which we can talk about equity and justice in these contexts. And so I'm the author of a book with another faculty member here at Cal State Fullerton, Nick Henning, and a colleague from the University of San Francisco, Ruchi Agarwal-Rangnath, on preparing to teach social studies for social justice. But my own background is as an English language arts teacher. And so most of the examples we'll be looking at tonight are drawn from English language arts and social studies classrooms that I've worked with over the years. And so I've invited you to take a moment and just let us know who you are and why you're here. I think a couple of folks may have responded in the chat box. And Jamie, do you want to sort of let us know what those chats might say? All right. So if you do want to introduce yourself later on, please feel free to do so. We'd be delighted to hear from you. And so basically what we're going to talk about tonight is some of the ways that we're thinking about what it means to teach for social justice in contemporary classrooms and what some of the questions that we may have as we engage in this work. And I always find it important to set the context. And so what we'll start off by telling you is where we are now. And so as we all know, we're teaching in 2019. This is a moment of intense political discord in the United States that sometimes is marked by what we call partisanship and fear. We have really strong perspectives on both the right and the left regarding what conversations we should be having, what the implications are for education, and also regarding some politically sensitive hot topics that sometimes come up in our classroom. We also know that there's been a dramatic increase in what we call identity-based bullying in schools. So this is bullying on the basis of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, religion, socioeconomic class, and so forth. Leading some scholars to do some research about the ways in which the controversies regarding the 2016 presidential election have impacted schools. A recent article was actually entitled, "For Millions of People, This is Real Trauma." And that's a quote from teachers talking about what it was like to teach in the days leading up to and immediately following the 2016 presidential election. As teachers are talking about the ways in which students are coming to school with all of the opinions and fears and biases that have been present throughout conversations about the 2016 presidential election. Now, meanwhile, for us as teachers, we're not only thinking about the political context, but we also need to think about the impacts that some of the rhetoric around politics can have on our students. And so this particular graphic I pulled from the New York Times in December of 2017, and it really characterizes this new concept that we have in the media, in education, this idea of an alternative fact, as if the reality is no longer reality. There's been a lot of questioning over what can we believe in the media, what are the ways in which we can believe politicians or not believe politicians. This particular graphic, which has continued to evolve over time, tracks the number of objectively provable falsehoods that were stated by different presidential candidates or presidents at different moments in time. And so this, which was published December 14th, 2017, indicates that in the first 10 months in office, President Trump had made 103 statements that were objectively provable as false. By contrast, over the course of 7 years, according to this, what President Obama made 18 of those kinds of statements. And this graphic is actually linked, and so you do have access to both this presentation and the research that supports it if you want to look at what some of those statements were and how it was that the New York Times determined whether they could be considered falsehoods or not. But irrespective of your political perspectives, we need to really think about what does it mean when we can't trust either the words coming out of the mouth of a politician or the way those words are represented in the media. Or we have to sort of grapple with students coming in and saying, hold on a minute, I don't know what I can trust in the news anymore. And so Stanford University did some research about the ways that some of these crises are impacting students' understanding of media and social media. And this particular study came out of the Stanford History Education Group and was published immediately before the 2016 presidential election. So the research itself happened between 2013 and 2015. And what their research found was that 82% of middle schoolers, and they tested middle schoolers all over the country, 82% of middle schoolers could not explain how to distinguish an advertisement on the internet from a news story. They were unable to say, oh, this is sponsored. They were unable to look for paid content. They just didn't have those types of media literacy skills. Additionally, half of college students in this research evaluated the validity of a tweeted quote-unquote fact based on the headline alone. They didn't even click on the article itself in order to determine where it was that this came from. And then finally, 2/3 of the college students who did click on the tweet failed to see the potential for political bias. And this particular research was done regarding surveys about gun owners' beliefs about background checks. Now, anyone that's involved in civic discourse or in conversations about politics and about gun rights and gun safety laws in the United States are aware of the intensity of the political perspectives around this. And yet 2/3 of college students, when looking at this and trying to determine whether or not a source was reputable, didn't question whether or not this source was politically motivated. And so for myself as a literacy educator, I'm pretty concerned about this. And so Harper Keenan out of Stanford University was doing some research right after the 2016 elections and said, what do we do with all of this as educators? And he argued that we must design educational experiences that are directly connected to the world where our students live. No more myths told as truth. Before each and every action we take in the classroom, we must ask ourselves, what does this do to end American racism, misogyny, and apathy? We must develop a more honest curriculum. We must put an end to any educational activity that does not connect to the realities children live, that prefabricates an oversimplified world for them. This does nothing but teach ignorance. We must tear down the barrier between the classroom and the world outside it and face what we can no longer ignore. And one of the things I love so much about education is that we get to read so many things, and sometimes we read something that really impacts us. And for me, this was one of those things that really sort of called out this idea of, oh, right, a more honest curriculum. And it made me think, okay, so what are the important, honest, current complexities that affect our world and the worlds of our students? And I encourage each of you to take a moment to reflect on sort of what those might be. What are they in your discipline? What are they in your classroom? And what do you want students to know and be able to do in regard to those complexities? And I'll pause for a moment in case anyone has anything they'd like to add to the conversation here regarding what some of those ideas might be before I jump into showing you some examples from other teachers.
Yeah, feel free to use the chat box if you want to ask the questions there. And also if you want to ask it, use the raise hand feature so I can unmute you so you're able to ask your question. We'll give you a moment to do that.
So I haven't seen, oh, it looks like we have a chat coming in here. All right, so I see a student noting that they're sort of teaching about biology and really thinking about some of these important, honest, and current complexities that affect our worlds and the worlds of students. When we think about biology, we might be thinking about sort of environmental impacts, we might be thinking about genetics, we might be thinking about some of the ways that identity is constructed and genetically defined or presumed to be genetically defined. And these are some of the kinds of conversations that come up in our student teaching classrooms and in our classrooms on a daily basis. And so I was a high school English teacher. And so one of the things that I really wanted to know as I was teaching high school English was, what are the different ways that teachers are thinking about this idea of teaching for social justice? You know, I felt like as a teacher, I knew what I was doing in my classroom. I knew the ways that I was thinking about sort of identity and culture and social issues in literature and in other types of interactions sort of outside of our classroom. But I wasn't really sure how other teachers were considering this idea. And so I did some research where I surveyed high school English teachers from around the country and asked them, what do you think of when you think of teaching for social justice? What does this mean to you? And overall, they focused on three specific things. They focused on this idea of curriculum, or what we teach, pedagogy, or how we teach it, and then this concept of social action. And so this framework, and there's a reference for it if you'd like to know more about what these teachers had to say or some examples of what this looked like in their classrooms. But they said overall, when we're teaching for social justice, we need curriculum that reflects students' personal and cultural identities, that includes explicit instruction about oppression, prejudice, and inequity, and that connects some of our curricular standards and social justice topics. Now, pedagogically, so this is how we teach. We want to create a supportive classroom climate that embraces multiple perspectives. We want to emphasize critical thinking and inquiry-based instruction, so asking questions, not telling answers. And also we want to promote students' academic, civic, and personal growth. I think about some of that research we were talking about just a moment ago from the Stanford History Education Group, and I don't ever want my students to judge whether or not something is factual based purely on the headline. I want them to think much more deeply about ideas, especially before they engage in types of civic processes like voting. In terms of social action, one of the things I thought was really interesting is that many teachers think of themselves as social activists. This might be activists around something small, like I had one teacher who said, my kids really love theater and our school doesn't have a stage. We don't have anywhere for them to put on a play. We don't have the space for something like that. And the wealthier school across town has lots of resources for theater. And so she engaged with her students in a letter writing campaign where they wrote to local education officials to say, hey, we're looking for some more resources because we really want to put on, in their case, it was a Shakespearean play they were really excited about. And so she thought of that work as engaging in activism alongside her students. In terms of social action, teachers are also looking to raise students' awareness of injustice and inequity. Instead of shying away from complicated or controversial conversations in the classroom, we address them head on and say, okay, this is happening. What can we learn about it? And then finally, teaching for social justice means promoting students' social action, not telling students to do what you want them to do or to act in ways that you think they should or to agree with you politically, but rather saying, okay, you have a well-researched, well-founded idea about something. You've done this kind of analysis. You've identified a problem. And then saying to students, so what are you going to do about it? What are some of the ways that you as a young person can use your voice in this particular moment? And so I'll pause for any quick questions we might have about this overall before I show you some examples from teachers I've worked with. It's always a little awkward when we do these kinds of webinars. I can't see you. I don't know what questions you're wondering about. So I'm going to trust that you will use the raise hand feature if you have any questions as we're going through this. And I am always happy to pause for a moment and answer those questions. Jamie is also reading the chat box. So while I'm not seeing it as you're typing live, he is, and would be happy to summarize or pipe in to let me know that someone has a question.
Yes, and also feel free to if you want to unmute, put that in the chat box and I'll mute you also as another way to ask questions.
Yes, you don't have to type it out. Feel free to talk back. We're all still figuring out these types of virtual interactions. And so, as I'm thinking about this model of teaching for social justice and what it looks like, one of the questions I had for teachers is, how do you actually do this? How do you do this in standards-based classrooms? I know when I was a high school English teacher, my principal would walk into my classroom sometimes and turn to one of my students and say, what standard are you working on today? And he expected them to be able to say, we're working on standard 36.2, which says blah, blah, blah. Or I had to be able to justify how every conversation we were having was designed to prepare them either for the state standardized tests or for their SATs or for their ACTs or in some other way related back to the curriculum that I was required to teach. And similar conversations come up in schools across the country. And so some of what I found so interesting is when I asked teachers, how can we teach for social justice in heavily regulated classrooms? That is, those classrooms where we really are held to a very strict guidelines from the school regarding what we should do. One of my teachers said, I see the standards the way an architect might see building codes. While building codes may seem restrictive, a creative person can build a structure that is beautiful, creative, functional, and up to code. And I love this idea of thinking about standards not as something that boxes us in, but really something that we can sort of stand upon while we create something really magical with our students. Another teacher that I worked with said, I specifically chose to teach English because the standards are mostly skill-based rather than content-based. Students are engaged in highly analytical activities and higher order thinking and creative thinking on a daily basis. That kind of analysis requires specific skills that are embedded within the English language arts standards, like persuasive writing, character analysis, etc. So my content area allows for much flexibility. It is a purposely spread common misconception that teaching standards and teaching for social justice are mutually exclusive. The latter is somehow seen as simply having fun with students or engaging them in touchy-feely activities through which they gain no real skills. That is completely erroneous. And I think about some of the conversations that I've had with some of you who are here today about the ways in which you're teaching about, say, environmental racism in your biology classrooms and how you're doing so in very standards-aligned ways, or other conversations I've had with some of you about sort of ethnic studies curriculum and some of the ways that we might interrogate history, or how we might look at mathematical applications related to common social issues. There are so many ways in which we can connect academically rigorous content to concepts related to social justice, to engaging students in conversations about critical social issues. So let's look at how we might do this. So this next example I'm going to show you comes out of a high school I worked with in Chicago. Now, this particular high school was one that was under oversight by the district because there were some concerns about whether or not students were meeting the benchmark. And the teachers had been directed to find ways to meet a very specific set of standards by doing close reading. That was the emphasis in the school. And for those who don't know, close reading is essentially when you look very, very closely and directly at a text and then analyze the words, analyze each phrase, each sentence to get a sense of what is the author's purpose, what are the different ways in which the author's using rhetoric, and what have you. And then the teachers were required on a weekly basis to spend 1 day a week working with their students to develop the skills to prepare them for the ACTs, which was the test that this school was sort of most interested in, as well as some other district level tests. And a group of teachers had come together and the principal tasked them with finding an important text to read. And one of the teachers said, what about the Gettysburg Address, which is absolutely an important text, but perhaps not the most exciting text for students at this particular high school. And at this time, it was about 2016. They were like, that's a little bit outdated. Can we find something a little bit more local, a little bit more relevant? And at this moment, there was so much happening in Chicago. There were lots of conversations about racially correlated violence. There were lots of conversations about police-involved shooting. There was a lot of community dialogue happening. Very sort of highly charged context. And students were coming to school talking about what had happened on the news or what had happened outside of school or whatever the latest controversy was. And so one teacher came in and said, hey, I found this poem. And the poem that she brought forth was one by sort of Malcolm London. And so I'm going to show you what this poem looks like in just a moment. But as we consider this example, I invite you to sort of think about when you are thinking about a social justice topic, what are some of the natural connections that it might be for your content area? In the case of the example we're going to look at, it's how can this relate back to that standard a teacher is trying to teach. In this example, the teacher also followed the interest of her students. They were coming in talking about what was happening on the streets. She said, maybe we can find something that's happening on the street to talk about here. But also we need to be really attentive to local mandates and institutional priorities. And so let's look at how this teacher did that. So in this particular example, the teachers were required to address 2 specific literacy standards. One of these comes out of the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts and Literacy. And this standard is to determine a central idea of a text and then analyze its development over the course of the text, including how it emerges and is shaped and refined by specific details, Provide an objective summary of the text. So this is what students are expected to do by the end of 9th and 10th grade. This school is also really focused on the ACT standards, and 2 standards in specific that they really wanted students to work with. They wanted students to be able to identify a clear central idea or theme in somewhat challenging passages or their paragraphs, and then be able to summarize key supporting ideas and details in somewhat challenging passages. And so in this example, now Malcolm London is a former Chicago public school student, and he wrote this poem we're about to see while he was in high school. He went on to get sort of nationally recognized for his work as a spoken artist, and this is a TED Talk that he did featuring this poem. So I'm going to go ahead and play this poem. Each of you should have also received an email from Jamie prior to the start of the webinar where you have the full text of this poem, if you'd like to read along with the lyrics. But we'll talk about it after we watch this video. For other folks that are watching and don't have access to that packet, you can access the lyrics to this poem at the URL on your screen. So let's go ahead and watch this, and then we'll talk about it together.
At 7:45 a.m., I opened the doors to a building dedicated to building, yet only breaks me down. I march down hallways cleaned up after me every day by regular janitors, but I never had the decency to honor their names. Lockers left open like teenage boys' mouths when teenage girls wear clothes that covers the insecurities but exposes everything else. Masculinity mimics by men who grew up with no fathers. Camouflage worn by bullies who are dangerously armed but need hugs. Teachers pay less than what it cost them to be here. Oceans of adolescents come here to receive lessons but never learn to swim. Part like the Red Sea when the bell rings. This is a training ground. My high school is Chicago, diverse and segregated on purpose. Social lines are barbed wire. Labels like regulars and honors resonate. I am in honors, but go home with regular students who are soldiers in territory that owns them. This is a training ground to sort out the regulars from the honors, a reoccurring cycle built to recycle the trash of this system. Trained at a young age to capitalize, letters taught. Now the capitalism raises you, but you have to step on someone else to get there. This is a training ground. But one group is taught to lead and the other is made to follow. No wonder so many of my people spit bars, because the truth is hard to swallow. The need for degrees has left so many people frozen. Homework is stressful. But when you go home every day and your home is work, you don't want to pick up any assignments. Reading textbooks is stressful, but reading does not matter when you feel your story is already written, either dead or getting booked. Taking tests is stressful. But bubbling in a Scantron does not stop bullets from bursting. I hear education systems are failing, but I believe they're succeeding at what they're built to do, to train you, to keep you on track, to track down an American dream that has failed so many of us all.
So when we think about something like that, like just take a moment and imagine the impact as a high school student of reading this poem and then analyzing it versus reading the Gettysburg Address. Again, not to say Gettysburg Address is not a really important text for us to read, but rather there are other ways that we can have these kinds of conversations in the classroom. And so let's look at what this teacher did with this. And for those of you that have clicked on the link and have access to the lyrics, you also see the lesson plan that she created. But so these are the elements of the lesson. So students watched the video, they read the poem, and then they went back and they did all of these standard sort of English language arts kinds of things with this poem. So first they were to state the central argument made by Malcolm London, And then they were to write an analysis of 1 to 2 paragraphs in which they provided at least 2 pieces of relevant textual evidence from the text that supports the central argument. Next, they were asked to draw inferences from the text. And so they were asked, what can you infer about the poet's view of high school? Support your answer with textual evidence. So much there in London's poem for us to think about. Next, they had to analyze key details. And in this case, the teacher pulled out a line from the text and says in lines 30 to 33, London states reading textbooks is stressful, but reading does not matter when you feel your story is already written, either dead or getting booked. And they have to explain what he means by that phrase and analyze how the phrase emphasizes the poet's central argument. And then finally, they were asked to really evaluate his argument overall and answer this question: to what extent do you agree or disagree with the author's central argument? Cite specific textual evidence to support your answer. Now, interestingly, these questions were exactly the same ones that had been on the district benchmark regarding the Gettysburg Address, with the change of substituting a line from the poem instead of a line from Gettysburg Address. And so what the teacher did in this case is chose a text that she knew her students would find sort of highly engaging, directly relevant to their lives outside of the classroom, and very relevant to sort of the political and historical and social moment that they were in, the same conversation that they were having in the hallway before they walked into her English language arts class. She was now saying, this is a relevant conversation for us to have right here. Let's talk about what this looks like. But she's doing it in a way that is not just a conversation about, hey, what do y'all think about school? What are we doing well? What do we need to work on? But instead, it's in a way that's academically rigorous, that's directly designed to prepare them to meet the state standards, and then it's directly aligned to the types of academic conversations that they're going to be having in order to succeed on some of the state-mandated tests. And so, you know, I'd like to pause here for a moment and see if anybody has any thoughts or questions or comments about this poem or about this way of teaching, and whether this is something that you can see yourself doing or have some questions about. But I'll pause for a moment to see if anybody has questions. So I don't see any hands popping up. Oh, there's one.
Yes, so the question is from Noel. And they asked how to encourage at-risk, mostly African-American male high schoolers to continue their education.
So that's a big question that is bigger than I'm going to answer on the fly right here. I think one of the things that I find most beneficial when I think about how do I get students engaged in educational experiences is I think about how do I make what's happening in class feel like it matters, feel like it's something that's important, feel like it's something that they desperately need in order to have the life that they want to have outside of the classroom. And so I know for me, one of the things that I often do is I think about this idea of emergent curriculum, which is where the curriculum emerges from the lives, from the priorities, from the questions of our students. And so if you were a student of mine and you sort of came in and said, hey, I'm really thinking about this idea of how do I encourage African-American students to feel engaged in the classroom? I would say, well, wow, that's a really interesting question. You know, we have a research paper coming up in the next couple of weeks. And most of the students are going to be thinking about this other topic, but I think you probably could do the same kinds of research around that question. Why don't you go out and choose that as the focus for your upcoming research paper? And then when you're doing our presentations later on, you can share with us what you've learned, and we can talk about that together. Now, what that means for me as a teacher is that if my goal is to have you research something, have you develop an evidence-based argument, have you develop the presentation skills necessary to present an argument back to the class, why wouldn't I allow you to choose a topic that was one you were really passionate about? That was something that came up when I was teaching high school English. We were required to have all students do a research paper. Now, most of the teachers at the school where I taught offered the same set of canned questions year after year after year. We used to joke that students would just sell the papers in the bathrooms between years because we got the same papers over and over again. They couldn't have been interesting for the students to write. They certainly weren't interesting for us to read. And so one of the first things I did is really worked on sort of changing up those questions so that students could choose their own topic. Because when it's something we care about, we're more inclined to do the research. And so we sometimes as teachers have to let go of control just a little bit so our students can direct their learning a bit more. That's one of the strategies I found most effective. But I'd be happy to sort of share some additional resources related to that afterwards. Or if you go to my website, there's a URL for it at the end of this presentation. There are links to some of the articles I've written about teaching for social justice that reference some of the research on culturally responsive and culturally sustaining pedagogy that you may find interesting.
Okay, we also have another question in the chat. I kind of missed it before Noel's. It says, referring to your dimensions of teaching for social justice, then, would this be an instance of curriculum?
Yeah, so this would be an example of both curriculum and pedagogy. So it's curriculum, it's the content or what is taught. It's also the pedagogy, it's how it's taught. And so this is following in some ways the pedagogical structures or the ways of teaching that were put into place by this particular school. You read this very closely, analyze it in this particular way. But the next step of this lesson, which I haven't gotten to quite yet, is an example of how this teacher changed up the pedagogy a bit to deepen this conversation. So it's a great question. And so I'll show you what that looked like. So after students did all of this stuff they were required to do, they watched this video, they analyzed this poem, they had some really interesting conversations about it. The next thing she said was, so in 2015, a fellow youth activist accused Malcolm London of sexual assault. And this is another young person in Chicago, very publicly on social media and in the newspaper, accused him of assaulting her. And so she turned to her students and she said, so does this impact your thoughts about whether or not we should teach this poem in schools? And she brought this question up after they had just finished talking about why it was so great that they were reading this poem instead of the Gettysburg Address. And she said to them, okay, so let's complicate this a little bit, because that's really what critical thinking is. It's not saying that London's poetry is more or less important than the Gettysburg Address, although I think we could argue it's less important than the Gettysburg Address given its historical context. But it's not saying one type of curriculum is better or more important than another. It's saying we need to think really critically about curriculum and be really thoughtful about what we bring in. And so oftentimes when I present this example, teachers will say, oh, this is a great poem, I can't wait to teach it tomorrow. And then we raise this question and say, okay, so should we teach it or not? He's been accused of sexual assault. And then we can say, would your answer change if you knew that London acknowledged causing harm to his victim? And so he said, yeah, okay, I hear that, and I caused harm here. And so he didn't deny the accusation, but rather acknowledged it. And then to sort of delve into this even more deeply, London and his victim ended up participating in a year-long community accountability group, or restorative circle, a transformative justice practice related to this assault, during which they came together in a facilitated way to try and make some kinds of reparations, both him to her and also the two of them who were members of the same community of young people to their larger community. And so there's nothing simple and clear-cut about this, right? And so is it appropriate or inappropriate to teach this work of poetry? Is it appropriate or inappropriate to center the narratives written by somebody who admittedly engaged in assault? Does it matter if someone tries to undo or make reparations for the harm that they caused? And then after having some of these conversations, we can then sort of bring it up to the current moment. And we as educators can delve deeper and say, okay, we've just had this conversation about this one poet and this one poem, but let's consider other high-profile accusations of sexual assault and misconduct. And the Me Too movement overall, let's think of all of the politicians and celebrities who have been accused of sexual harassment or assault in public ways over the last year. And we have to ask ourselves, what is our individual and collective responsibility to acknowledge and or act upon these accusations within and beyond the classroom? Some of my favorite novelists have been accused of sexual assault in very public ways by multiple people. Does that mean that we shouldn't teach them? Why or why not? Who's held accountable and in what ways? And again, by asking these kinds of questions during which we as teachers, A, don't have easy right answers, and B, we don't claim to have the answer that our students are supposed to come to. I don't ask these questions because I think absolutely yes, you should teach Malcolm London, or absolutely not, you never should. But rather because as an educator, I think you need to think really hard about this. I think you need to investigate these questions and come to that place of your own conscience. That's the work of teaching for social justice, and really thinking pedagogically about how to think critically and prepare our students to think critically about very complicated real life situations. So I'll pause for a moment there, Jamie. I don't know if you had other questions.
Yeah, it's another question, Alex, in the chat box. He says, with so many social injustices occurring every day, how do you choose which is more applicable? Is giving students the choice a better approach?
So that's a great question, Alison. And I always say follow the interests of your students. Now, sometimes there'll be cases where it's really clear cut. A student will walk into your classroom talking about something on a particular day, and I'll say, okay, so this is something we're going to have to explore. And I am not, as a teacher, I like to think I have superpowers, but I don't. Like, students come into my classroom all the time talking about something I know nothing about. And so sometimes the best I can do is say, wow, that's a really awesome question. I'm going to see if we can come back to that later on this week. And I'll go home and I'll get on Google and I'll start doing my homework to begin to learn a little bit more about something. As you become a more experienced educator, you'll be more able to sort of be comfortable with the unknowability that comes with following your students' interests. For example, I've learned that if I'm going to structure a research experience for my students, where they're allowed to research topics that I don't actually know a lot about, I need to provide a lot of scaffolding. I need to have very clear expectations regarding what counts as a reliable source and what doesn't. What defines a good researchable question, and what are some of the ways that I can help them identify those? Do I need to identify outside experts that they might be able to consult or go to around topics that I don't know a lot about? What are the dates by which different things will be due? The more freedom I give my students in terms of content and following their interest, the more scaffolds and structures I provide to help them succeed as they do that. Now, as a first-year teacher, that was really intimidating. I didn't know how to teach the research process. I didn't know how to coach students in analyzing a poem. So analyzing a poem nobody else at my school had ever analyzed before, that felt really scary. So I had to think about, how do I find people to vet my curriculum with? I wouldn't have taught this lesson without going over it with another teacher and saying, hey, do you think that the way I'm structuring this works? Do you have any suggestions? And so those are some of the things I do when I'm following my students' interest. In other times when you're thinking about teaching for social justice, something will come up in the world and your students might not be talking about it yet, but you know, like, wow, we have to be talking about this because they are thinking about it, even if we're not actually talking about it. And the next example that I have for you is one of those. So this example actually comes out of the classes that I teach here at Cal State Fullerton, one of which is a course on teaching literacy in secondary schools. And I was teaching this course as we were sort of having lots of tweets coming up about some of the executive orders related to immigration. And in this particular class, I just taught about that Stanford research that I cited earlier, about the ways in which students don't necessarily know how to vet information that's coming up online. And then all of a sudden, we had this barrage of executive orders related to immigration. And the president said during a press conference, even a bad high school student would understand this. He was just so upset about the ways in which people were misinterpreting or interpreting in what he perceived inaccurately some of his executive orders, and was very upset that these executive orders were coming under legal scrutiny. And I thought, well, so is that true? Would a bad high school student understand the complexities of immigration reform in the United States or immigration policy in the United States? And I would argue that some of the most accomplished legal scholars in the US are struggling to understand immigration policy and immigration reform in the United States. And I wasn't totally confident that I, as a professor of education, really understood immigration policy and immigration reform in the US. And meanwhile, here, right in the area where we teach in LA, this particular picture is from some of the protests that were happening at LAX as folks were trying to figure out, like, can I get off the plane? I was on vacation. What happens now? Like, what's going on? Can I travel? Can I not travel? Is this something that was a Muslim ban? Is this something that's designed to protect folks? What's happening? And so my students walked into class the week that this was happening, and nobody said, hey, can we talk about the immigration executive orders today? But it was everywhere. And I knew lots of my students, both were immigrants, had family members who were immigrants, had international travel planned in their worlds, or were in mixed status families, meaning some of the members of their families were documented, some members of their family were not documented. Perhaps some members of their family had US citizenship, other folks had green cards, and what have you. And so I thought, okay, we need to figure out how to sort of delve into this just a little bit. The other things that I knew about the courses that I teach is I teach in an ideologically diverse space. I do not assume that all of the students in my classroom share a political perspective, share a philosophical perspective, share beliefs about immigration policy, nor do I think they should all have the same perspectives about immigration, about politics, and what have you. But rather, we all need to have the skills to think in complicated ways about complicated issues. And so the course that I teach is designed for pre-service literacy educators, for pre-service teachers. And so I thought about what are the goals of my course? Well, I want to prepare my students to be able to teach their own K through 12 students about literacy. I wanted to prepare my students to interact critically with the media, but also teach their students to interact critically with the media. And I also wanted to prepare my students to teach about complicated, controversial issues. This isn't easy. And I know lots of teachers and honestly lots of professors will shy away from complicated topics. And so I wanted to model how do you engage with these complicated things without setting up your class to be a screaming match or a debate when that's not your goal. And so one of the things I did in this particular lesson, which you also have links to in the PDFs that Jamie sent around or in the URL that I'll put up later on, is I brought in a range of ideologically divergent but reputable newspaper articles about the executive orders. And so I had some that were from newspapers that are generally considered to be on the left and others from newspapers generally considered to be on the right, but all of them from sources that are generally well-sourced and well-respected within the field. And I assigned students in small groups to read one of the articles. They didn't have to read them all, though I gave them access to all of the articles, but to talk with some peers about one of those articles. And then they had to answer some questions regarding that executive order and its implications, citing evidence from their assigned article. So I wasn't asking students, what's your opinion about the executive order? Instead, I said, what does this article say the executive order is? What does this article say the rationale for the executive order is? According to this article, is the executive order legal? Why or why not? So the focus was on reading a text and citing evidence. And then sort of beginning to, in some cases, make a claim or take a stance based upon the evidence in their article and the evidence in their article only. Then we debriefed the experience as a whole class. And I asked them to think not only as students, so how do we talk about this? They shared their articles, they shared their responses with the rest of the class, but I also had them think about it as future teachers. And we talked together about how do you decide, how did you in reading this one article decide what was trustworthy evidence? How did I decide which articles to bring in and which ones to leave out? And then we talked together about how intelligent people could come to different conclusions based on this evidence. Part of what I really want my students to think about, and I want all of our students to think about, is that these complicated questions and issues don't have one right answer, but rather we need to be able to look at an issue, get a sense of the whole perspective. Now, that's not to say that all controversial issues have equal 50-50 sides, right? Sometimes, in the case, for example, of climate change, we have 97% of climate scientists agreeing that global warming is caused by humans, and 3% saying, yeah, no, not so much, I don't think so. It would be false in a classroom to position those as a 50-50 debate and say to your students, okay, let's agree to disagree on this, when the overwhelming preponderance of evidence from folks that have expertise in the field, certainly more expertise than I do, say, well, actually global warming is caused by human factors. So then we need to teach students how to really think critically about complicated issues when perhaps there's more than just an objective analysis of evidence happening. We need to think about what are some of the motivations for why some scientists would say global warming is not caused by human factors, or are there political questions that interact with global warming, and so forth. And so we need to be very thoughtful about how we teach the idea of critical analysis. Critical analysis is not saying all sides are equally possible, but rather let's look at the arguments on each side so that we're really able to weigh their relative merit and take an individual stance. Now, this is not easy as teachers. We need to be very careful that we're not telling students what to think or how to think, but rather that we're teaching them how to engage in the sort of critical thinking process about complicated ideas, and then how to talk effectively with people who don't necessarily share their perspectives. Because what ultimately we want them to do is be ready to engage in these kinds of complicated conversations outside of the classroom. And so I'll pause just for a moment there before I offer one final example of what this looks like. And so the final set of examples that I'll offer is one more way that we can sort of follow our students' interest. So this is another example that I pull from some of the literacy classes that I teach here at Cal State Fullerton. I actually think some of you that are here for this webinar will be doing this in just a little bit. So these particular examples are one of the ways that I help follow students' interest when teaching literacy-related content. So one of the things I have students in my literacy classes do is, these students are all pre-service teachers, is choose an issue that they're passionate about and then create a 3 to 5 minute podcast about that issue and develop curriculum to indicate how they would use that podcast in the classroom. And I generally offer no additional guidance regarding topic selection, just that it has to connect to their disciplines, the content area that they want to teach in some way. And then also that it has to be something that sort of connects to literacy that they can really use to support students' literacy development. And so I've done this with hundreds of students over the last several years, 70 of whom who've agreed to make their podcasts publicly available. And so you'll have access to the link if you go to my website or the URL that's at the end of this presentation. But these are a list of some of the disciplinary concepts that students have chosen to highlight in these podcasts. Everything from analyzing primary sources in history to content and composition and photography to love, sexism, and Shakespeare. And about maybe about 40% of students have explicitly chosen to research things that we would think of as really controversial, whether it's the idea of censorship in banned books, it's children's perspectives on gun laws, it's examining media bias or global warming. I had a physical education biology student look at the idea of GMOs and food science, what's healthy and not healthy. Is talk radio political propaganda? What's the role of music in political movements? How do we teach evolution in diverse classrooms, in this case, in classrooms where students have religious opposition to the idea of evolution? It's really complicated things. And again, in thinking about how we can give power to students to explore the ideas that are most interesting to them, I don't tell students what topics they have to choose or what stance they need to take on these, but rather, you need to explore this issue. You need to develop some curriculum to help your own future students engage around these complicated ideas. And you need to do so using the tools that we're talking about right here. So in this case, using the literacy skills that I've taught you all semester. If I were to do this in my own high school English classroom, I wouldn't say develop curriculum. I would say, give me an example of an evidence-based analysis, or develop a well thought out organizational structure for your podcast, or what have you. Talk to me about the vocabulary that you're using in your podcast. Some of the things that we're required to teach in high school English classrooms. Likewise, for the students that develop these podcasts, they may be talking about, say, the economic impacts of some of the financial aid issues that come up. And they're using very complicated mathematical formula to delve into the implications of financial aid packages and federal funding for higher education. Or they're looking at the biology standards as they relate to food science, or as they relate to evolution, or as they relate to genetic markers, and so forth. So they're looking at these through the lenses of the content that they're required to teach or is most directly related to their discipline. So does anybody have any questions? Jamie, I don't know if we got to all of the questions in the chat box that had come up before.
Yeah, I think we got all the questions. There was just a comment that says, "This is great, moving beyond the safe text."
Oh, great. I love it. So I'm glad it's useful. And so these kinds of things that I'm sharing here, the book that I wrote around teaching social studies for social justice includes examples from social studies educators across the country. And some of the articles that are linked up on my website have a lot of examples from English language arts. But there are also examples from all sorts of disciplines. And so my website's alisongdover.com, and there I have examples from pre- and in-service teachers who have agreed to make their curriculum available for other teachers that are interested in thinking about teaching for social justice. Some of these are from the sciences. I have one unit that a student who was teaching in a very wealthy and affluent, predominantly white suburban community in Chicago, was trying to think about how could she get her students thinking about environmental justice when she knew that many of them lived very privileged lives and had a very privileged experience. And so she developed a unit where students were doing soil testing in their local community, and then doing soil testing in inner city Chicago, and really getting a sense of what is the level of ground pollution in diverse, socioeconomically and racially diverse communities. And then what they discovered is that the soil where they lived was cleaner than the soil in inner city Chicago. And so she had her students thinking about, what does that mean for the health of the food we grow in our backyards? What are the ways in which environmental racism impacts our daily experience? And it was really eye-opening for her students, who were thinking about the ways in which, oh wow, like just because of where I live, I have access to something that somebody living in another community might not. Likewise, I have students that have created units around energy sources, really looking at sort of the engineering of renewable energy, the cost of renewable energy. Lately, there have been some changes in regulations regarding how renewable energy is funded, what options we have, and so forth, as well as units related to art education. And so there's really no limit. You can teach and talk about contemporary social issues and social justice in any discipline. There are just a few things that we need to keep in mind as we think strategically about teaching for social justice. One of the scholars that I admire most, Julie Gorleski, said that teaching for social justice is about critical compliance and reflective resistance. And I love this idea, sort of walking the tightrope, right? That we are complying with the mandates that we're required to. As teachers in public schools, you are required to address the standards that have been implemented by the state in which you're teaching. And so we're not doing our students any service if we don't teach towards those standards and our students fail the high stakes test, or aren't ready for the next grade, or don't have the skills they need for college. We need to make sure we're doing that. And also, when we encounter mandates that we think, wow, that's really restrictive. I know when I was teaching high school English, I think I've probably told some of you, when I was teaching high school English, they handed me a list of the books I was required to teach in 10th grade, and every single one of them was written by a dead white male. And funny enough, none of my students were dead white men. And so, I had to think about, like, okay, so my students are not going to see themselves reflected on this book list. What can I do about it? How can I diversify this curriculum? How can I make sure that I'm bringing in perspectives that aren't already here? And one of the things that I found so useful that teachers have said to me is we need to think about how to embrace our standards, reframe our standards to think a little bit differently about them, and then sometimes resist things that we see happening at schools. You will, at some point in your career, have an administrator tell you to do something that you don't think is in the best interests of the children in your classroom. And as you become experienced educators, and as you know you're able to support your students' learning and create academically rigorous and robust classroom environments, sometimes you might need to say, hey, that policy, I'm gonna see if we can find a way around this, or I'm gonna work with this in a slightly different way. I know in my classroom, I was required to spend 20% of my time preparing my students for standardized testing. It was one of the school-wide mandates. And so I had to really think about, what does it mean to prepare students for standardized testing? What if we did things like this Malcolm Gladwell poem, this Malcolm London poem, and we read something and we just write questions that look like standardized test questions, but are actually related to topics that I wanted to be talking about in our classroom. And so you sometimes have to engage in strategic resistance. And so some of the other things that I'll sort of have us think about as we begin to wrap up is, as you're building curriculum, really pay attention to context. What's up where you are? What do your students care about? Because that's where you should start. It's not about my agenda. Let's talk about what interests me. It's what interests you? What are the conversations you want to have? And how can we link them in with the other things we're sort of required to teach? What do your standards require? What do they encourage? What do they allow? Like those teachers we mentioned earlier, I encourage you to be standards conscious. Know what your standards are. Make sure you're addressing them. But don't be standards driven. If you're engaging in the important conversations in your discipline, you'll get there. You'll hit those standards. There might be one or two. For me, it was always about grammar. There might be some that you need to make sure you pay special attention to. But otherwise, if you're engaged in academically rigorous conversations, you'll get there. So know what they are and make them work for you. I always tell my teachers to think about this idea of interest convergence. That's how can our ideas come together? What's the win-win? What can you do that will make sure your students learn, that will keep them engaged, that will please your administrators, that will respond to the priorities of your families and parents, how can you help everybody see that this is in everybody's interest for us to read more relevant content or use math to solve real world problems or read about this really exciting scientific controversy or what have you. And then finally, do your homework. Know that teaching for social justice has a really solid research base and has been proven to have a demonstrably positive impact on students' academic, behavioral, motivational, and attitudinal outcomes. You don't have to take my word for it. Click through the links. There are hundreds of articles about the ways in which these types of teaching practice are linked very explicitly and directly to improved student performance. And so knowing that research will enable you to talk to your principal, to talk to your colleagues, to talk to your professors about why this work is so important for us all to engage in the classroom. And so in just a moment, I'm going to stop talking and take any closing questions before turning it back over to Jamie. And I'll leave sort of the summary slide up here for all of us to think together, as well as a URL that includes curricular examples of all of the examples that I mentioned today, copies of lesson plans and other kinds of resources. And I'll pull us to the last slide, which has my personal website on it, which is alisongdover.com, and that has all of the research I've done on this, as well as examples from teachers, many of whom are not necessarily referenced in this particular presentation, but have agreed to share their work. So I'll stop talking there and take any questions, and then I know Jamie has a couple of things he'd like to share with you towards the end.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Noel. Any other tips for building an exclusive classroom for diverse students?
So building an exclusive classroom. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Noel. What do you mean by an exclusive classroom?
Oh, inclusive, sorry.
Okay, an inclusive classroom for diverse students. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of research out there on it. And so one of the things that I always try and do is I want to really see my students, and I want to make sure my students know that they're seen. And so, Noel, I don't know what your discipline is, but as an English language arts teacher, I feel like I have the opportunity to bring stories into the classroom all the time. And so one of the first things I did the first week of school when I was teaching is I would do sort of autobiographical poetry. I would share examples of sort of who am I poems with my students. I'd have all of my students bring in a picture that represented something in their life. It could be a picture of their home or a picture of somebody or something that was important to them. And I had a wall in my classroom where we made a mural of us. I had 5 classes and about 120 students. And they would come together and they'd all put their pictures up and they'd have their names on the back and make sure you vet the pictures, that there's nothing awful going up there because, you know, kids are kids. But we'd put these pictures up and then we'd use those pictures to have conversations about some of the English language arts concepts we needed to talk about. We would talk about what are common themes in this picture? What kinds of symbols do you notice? What are the settings that you see here? Sometimes we would use them to teach about, say, compare and contrast. Compare and contrast the composition of 2 photographs on our wall. Sometimes we would talk about based upon this, what are the types of stories that people are trying to tell about themselves? If this were, say, a science context, we might talk about what are some of the environmental factors that you see here? What can you assume or presume about environment or about sort of spheres of influence or what have you? In a math classroom, you might look at those and make some graphs. What percentage of these pictures show houses or where people live? What percentage show people? What percentage of them have this particular feature or that feature? I mean, lots of different ways that you can bring in students' lives. And from that little bit in those first couple of days of classroom, I get to know a little bit about who my students are. And they also know that I care about who they are. I'll go back and reference that wall throughout the year. Maybe as we're thinking about getting ready for a unit on poetry, I say, bring in some of your favorite songs, and I'll look through those songs and see if I can find lyrics that have alliteration or have really exciting metaphors or that have, you know, good examples of connotation. So my students know that I'm affirming what they consider important, their identity, the types of things that they listen to, the types of questions that they have. I don't pretend that I know everything about the music that my 15-year-olds are listening to, but I can pull in those examples right from them. and so forth. And by having those kinds of interactions with students, you can affirm that you see them as individuals. You can also do the research that it takes to know sort of what's going on in your community. If you're teaching somewhere, you should also be going out to eat in that district. You should be hanging out there on the weekends. You should go to the library and see what's happening there. You should ask your students, what do they do when they're not in school? The more that you know about your students and their worlds, the better connected you are to their parents, the more you know about the communities in which they live, the more effectively you'll be able to leverage those tremendous assets and resources in your own classroom. Jamie, are there other questions that we have from folks?
Not at this time. If you give it a little bit more second, see if anybody has any other questions, or if you want me to unmute you, please feel free to ask. I'm happy to do that for you.
And so while folks are conjuring questions, again, you have all of my contact information here. You have my website and my email address. So I'm faculty here at Cal State Fullerton. Feel free to send me an email if you're one of our students. I'm happy to chat with you during my office hours or welcome you into a future class. It's always a treat for us to get to have these kinds of conversations about the things that excite us most. We don't always get to talk about it in the classes that we teach. And so I certainly appreciate this opportunity. And any other questions that folks have now or in the future. I tend to publish pretty widely on this stuff. So if you're looking for some concrete examples or classroom vignettes, do check out these websites. There are free copies of all of my articles available on them.
Before we do go, I'm gonna put in the chat box our survey, and it's just gonna help us kind of get a feel of how we're doing on the webinars, get a little bit of feedback and evaluation, just to help overall better our whole webinar series. So if you can, take a moment just to click on the link and kind of answer some of the questions we have in the survey. And yeah, at this time, if you guys have any other questions, let us know. I want to thank you, for all participating and joining us tonight, and also Alison for presenting. And if you guys have any other questions, let us know. Alison, you have any last words?
Thank you so much for being a part of this, and I certainly welcome any feedback about what was helpful, what recommendations you've had. As some of my students know, I haven't done this kind of webinar before, and so I'm always looking for ways to make it more engaging. And so don't hesitate to let me know if there's anything you'd like to commend or reach out to, and please do stay in touch.
Okay, perfect. Well, you guys have a great night. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, take care. Have a good one. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Take care.